Last Christmas, my father looked me dead in the eye and told me I was no longer welcome at the family celebration I had just spent $8,600 to make happen. That moment didn't just break my heart. It shattered every illusion I'd been clinging to about what family meant. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and for 32 years, I convinced myself that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, proved my worth enough, my father would finally see me as more than the daughter who reminded him of his failed first marriage. I thought money could buy me a seat at the table. I thought generosity could earn me the love that should have been freely given. But when my father banned me from the very Christmas I had funded, while my stepmother smirked and my stepsister rolled her eyes, I realized something that changed everything. If they could throw me out after I'd given them everything, then I could take back the one thing they actually needed from me. And watching their faces when I did exactly that became the best Christmas gift I ever gave myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before that devastating Christmas, I was sitting in my apartment in Portland's Pearl District, spreadsheets open on my laptop, calculating exactly how much of my December bonus I could allocate toward making this holiday perfect. The rain was doing that thing it does in Oregon, not quite pouring but persistent enough to make the windows weep with condensation. My phone buzzed with a text from my father, and despite everything I knew about our relationship, despite 32 years of evidence that should have taught me better, my heart still did that stupid little leap of hope. The text was unusually warm, almost affectionate in a way that felt foreign coming from Robert Mitchell. He wanted to do Christmas right this year, he wrote. A real family gathering. Something special to celebrate Patricia's 50th birthday and their 10th wedding anniversary. He mentioned Lake Tahoe, a luxury cabin, the whole family together for once. Then came the part that should have sent up every red flag I owned, but instead just made me feel needed. He was wondering if I might be willing to help with the costs, given that I'd just gotten that promotion at the financial firm. Nothing too much, he assured me. Just whatever I felt comfortable contributing. I stared at that message for a long time, watching the rain trace patterns down my window. My best friend Nicole's voice echoed in my head from a conversation we'd had just weeks earlier. She'd said, "Lauren, you can't keep trying to buy their love. It doesn't work that way. Your father is never going to suddenly become the dad you needed him to be just because you pay for things. But the thing about hope is that it's stubborn and irrational. It plants itself in your chest and refuses to die no matter how many times reality tries to kill it." My younger brother Jake called me that same evening. At 19, he was home from college for Thanksgiving break, and I could hear the excitement bubbling in his voice before he even said hello. "Lauren, did Dad tell you about Christmas? This is going to be amazing. A whole week at Lake Tahoe. He said we're finally going to do it right, like a real family." He paused, and I could hear something fragile in that pause, something that mirrored the hope I was trying to suppress in myself. "I've been working on something special. A photo album with pictures from when we were kids, back when Mom was still around. I thought maybe if Dad saw how good things used to be, he might remember." My throat tightened. Jake had been only 7 when our mother died from complications during what should have been a routine surgery. I'd been 15, old enough to become a second parent to him, old enough to watch our father retreat into his grief, and then emerge from it 2 years later with Patricia on his arm and Olivia trailing behind her. Old enough to recognize that we'd been replaced before we'd ever been properly mourned. Jake didn't remember the worst of it. He didn't remember Dad missing his 8th grade graduation because Patricia wanted to look at vacation properties that same week. He didn't remember the way our childhood home got boxed up and sold within months of Patricia moving in. All of Mom's things disappearing into storage units that Dad eventually just stopped paying for. Jake still believed in the possibility of connection, of reconciliation, of Dad suddenly waking up and deciding to be the father he'd been before grief and Patricia had reshaped him into someone we barely recognized. I couldn't bear to crush that hope. So instead of voicing my doubts, I said, "That sounds beautiful, Jake. I'm sure Dad will love it." And then, because I was already halfway to making the decision I'd regret, I asked, "Did Dad mention how much the cabin rental is?" Jake hesitated. I think he said something about it being expensive. Like really expensive. He was worried they might have to scale back. Maybe just do a dinner somewhere instead. He sounded so disappointed, Lauren. I told him you'd probably help. You always help. There it was. The expectation that had defined my role in this family for over a decade. Lauren always helps. Lauren always pays. Lauren always shows up with her checkbook open and her boundaries nowhere to be found. I pulled up my banking app while Jake kept talking, scrolling through my accounts, calculating what I could spare without completely draining my emergency fund. The promotion had been good. The bonus had been generous. I could afford to do this, technically speaking. The next morning, I called the property management company in Lake Tahoe myself. The cabin Dad had mentioned was a 5-bedroom luxury rental with a gourmet kitchen, a hot tub, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. The weekly rate during Christmas was $7,200. When I asked about additional services, the woman on the phone cheerfully informed me that they could arrange catering, firewood delivery, a fully stocked bar, and a private chef for Christmas dinner. By the time I hung up, I'd committed to a total of $8,600. I told myself it was an investment. Not just in a holiday, but in the possibility of rebuilding something that had been broken for so long. I pictured Jake's face when he saw the cabin, imagined my father actually relaxed and present for once, even dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this grand gesture would crack through whatever wall had existed between us since Patricia entered our lives. I transferred the deposit that afternoon, sent my father the confirmation details, and tried to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach that whispered I was making a terrible mistake. His response came an hour later. Thanks. Patricia says to remind you about the no pets policy. She's allergic. That was it. No gratitude, no acknowledgement of the financial burden I'd just taken on. Just a reminder about his wife's allergies. I sat there staring at those 2 sentences, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my chest. Nicole called right then, as if she had some kind of radar for when I was spiraling. When I told her what I'd done, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Lauren, she finally said, her voice careful in that way people use when they're trying not to say I told you so. What are you hoping is going to happen at this Christmas? What's the best case scenario in your head right now? I don't know, I admitted, which was only partially true. I did know. I was hoping for an apology that would never come. I was hoping my father would suddenly see me as something other than a convenient source of funding. I was hoping Patricia would drop her barely concealed contempt for just 1 week. I was hoping Olivia would stop treating Jake and me like embarrassing relics from her stepfather's past. I was hoping for magic, basically, and we both knew magic didn't exist. Just promise me you'll protect yourself, Nicole said. And protect Jake. He's young enough to still believe things can change, but you know better. Don't let them hurt him just because you're used to being hurt. That conversation haunted me through the first 2 weeks of December. I threw myself into work, analyzing portfolios and projecting market trends, finding comfort in numbers that behaved according to predictable patterns. But even spreadsheets couldn't completely distract me from the growing sense of dread. My preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father called once to confirm the dates, his tone businesslike and distant. Patricia sent a group text to the family chat about what everyone should bring, assigning Jake and me items from the bottom of the list, paper plates and plastic cups, while Olivia was entrusted with selecting wines and arranging flowers. Then 10 days before Christmas, my father called with what he described as a small change of plans. Patricia thinks it might be better if we keep this to immediate family only, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false casualness that meant he was delivering bad news he didn't want to deal with. Jake can still come, obviously, but Patricia's worried about the dynamics if you're there. She thinks your presence might make Olivia uncomfortable, given the age difference and history. I couldn't speak for a moment. The words didn't make sense, like he was speaking a language I should understand, but somehow couldn't process. I paid for the entire trip, I finally managed. $8,600, Dad. I rented the cabin. I hired the caterer. I arranged everything. And we appreciate that, he said, with the same energy someone might use to thank a caterer they'd never met. But this is really about what's best for the family dynamic. Patricia has some ideas about how to reimburse you. Maybe we can work out a payment plan or something. The important thing is that everyone feels comfortable, and right now Patricia doesn't think. I hung up. I actually just ended the call mid-sentence, something I'd never done to my father in my entire life. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't apologetic. He was simply informing me that I'd been uninvited from the Christmas I'd fully funded, because my presence might make my stepsister uncomfortable. The payment plan comment was almost funny in its absurdity, as if $8,600 was something that could be casually paid back over time by a man who'd taken early retirement, and whose wife's real estate career was modest at best. Jake called 30 seconds later, his voice high and tight with panic. "Lauren, what's happening? Dad just told me you're not coming to Tahoe. He said something about Patricia needing space and family dynamics. I don't understand. Did you two fight?" "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady for his sake. "We didn't fight. I just got uninvited from the trip I paid for. That's all." The silence on Jake's end was different from Nicole's silence. This was the sound of innocence cracking, of illusions beginning to shatter. "Then I'm not going either," he said. "If you're not welcome, I'm not going. This is insane." Part of me wanted to let him make that choice, wanted the solidarity of knowing I wasn't alone in seeing how wrong this was. But Jake was 19 and still living under Dad's roof when he wasn't at school. He didn't have the financial independence to make grand gestures of protest without serious consequences. "You should go," I told him. "Seriously. Take your photo album. Have a good time. Don't let this drama mess up your Christmas. How can you be so calm about this?" His voice cracked. "They're treating you like garbage. You paid for everything, and they're just kicking you out like you don't matter." "I'm not calm," I said, and that was the truest thing I'd said all day. "I'm furious. But I need to think about what to do next, and I need you to not blow up your relationship with Dad over this. Not yet. Just go to Tahoe. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention to how they treat you without me there as a buffer. And then we'll talk after Christmas, okay?" He agreed reluctantly, and after we hung up, I sat in my apartment as the early winter darkness fell over Portland, staring at my laptop screen. The rental agreement was still pulled up, along with the catering contract and the list of arrangements I'd made. Everything was in my name. Every payment had come from my account. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for a place at the table. I wasn't going to try to reason with people who'd already made it clear that my value began and ended with my bank account. Instead, I was going to do something my father would understand far better than any emotional appeal. I was going to show him exactly what happened when you bite the hand that feeds you. I spent the next morning on the phone with the property management company in Lake Tahoe, my voice steady and professional despite the storm of emotions churning underneath. The woman I spoke with, Amanda, remembered me from our previous conversation. She had that particular brand of cheerful efficiency that people in the hospitality industry perfect over years of dealing with demanding clients. When I explained that I needed to cancel the reservation, her tone shifted immediately to concern. "Oh no, Ms. Mitchell, I'm so sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, we're now within the 14-day cancellation window. According to the terms you agreed to, cancellations made less than 2 weeks before check-in are subject to a 50% cancellation fee. That would be $3,600 that we'd have to retain from your deposit. Is there any way you might reconsider, or perhaps postpone to a different date?" I'd already read those terms 3 times the night before, sitting in my dim living room with a glass of wine I never finished, planning this conversation with the same meticulous attention I gave to complex financial portfolios at work. "I understand the policy completely," I told her, "and I'm willing to accept the cancellation fee. However, I do have a question. If someone else wanted to book that same cabin for those same dates, would they be able to do so?" Amanda hesitated, and I could hear the clicking of her keyboard. "Well, yes, technically. Once a cancellation is processed, the property becomes available again. But Ms. Mitchell, it's highly unlikely someone would book a luxury property this close to Christmas. Most families have already made their arrangements. You might want to consider that you'd be losing $3,600 for nothing. I appreciate your concern, I said, keeping my voice warm and grateful. But I'd like to proceed with the cancellation. Could you walk me through the process? 20 minutes later, it was done. The reservation that had consumed my thoughts and drained my bank account no longer existed. I sat back in my office chair, the gray Portland morning light filtering through the windows of the financial firm where I'd worked for 8 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior portfolio manager, through sheer determination and endless overtime. My hands were trembling slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was adrenaline, the physical response to finally taking action instead of just absorbing whatever my father decided to dish out. The catering company was next. That conversation was easier. The woman I spoke with there was sympathetic when I explained there'd been a family emergency requiring cancellation. Their contract had a more forgiving cancellation policy. And since I'd only put down a 20% deposit of the $1,400 total, I was able to recover most of it. She processed the refund while we were still on the phone, her kindness a stark contrast to what I was dealing with from my own family. By lunchtime, I'd dismantled every arrangement I'd made for the Lake Tahoe Christmas. The private chef I'd hired for Christmas dinner, canceled. The premium firewood delivery service, canceled. The fully stocked bar package, canceled. The decorating service I'd splurged on because I wanted the cabin to look magical when everyone arrived, canceled. Each phone call felt like removing another brick from a structure I'd been foolish enough to build in the first place. Nicole met me for lunch at a small cafe near my office, taking an extended break from her teaching schedule, because she'd heard something in my voice that morning that worried her. When I told her what I'd done, she stared at me for a long moment, her sandwich forgotten on her plate. Then slowly she started to smile. It wasn't her usual warm, encouraging smile. This was something sharper, more satisfied. Good, she said simply. It's about damn time you stopped letting them treat you like an ATM machine with feelings they can just ignore. I haven't told them yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to wait until they show up at the rental office and discover there's no reservation. But that feels too cruel, even for me. Even after everything. Nicole leaned forward, her expression serious now. Lauren, what they did to you isn't just rude. It's financial abuse. You paid $8,600 for a family vacation, and they uninvited you. They literally took your money and then told you that you weren't good enough to benefit from your own generosity. That's not just cruel, that's sociopathic. Whatever you do next, don't let guilt make you protect them from the consequences of their own actions. Her words landed heavily, settling somewhere deep in my chest. Financial abuse. I'd never thought of it in those terms before, but hearing it named made something click into place. This wasn't the first time, was it? There was the $5,000 I'd loaned Dad for his truck down payment 3 years ago. Money he'd never mentioned paying back. The $1,700 I'd spent on Jake's laptop for college, which Dad had promised to split with me, but never did. The countless dinners I'd paid for, gifts I'd bought, emergencies I'd covered, all while being treated like I was somehow always falling short of their expectations. I'm going to tell Dad tonight, I decided. I'll call him and explain that since I'm not welcome at Christmas, I canceled the reservation. Simple and direct. No drama, no accusations, just facts. But when I tried calling my father that evening, the call went straight to voicemail. I tried twice more over the next few hours with the same result. Finally, around 9 o'clock, Patricia called me instead. Her voice had that particular edge it always carried when she talked to me. Like she was perpetually annoyed by my existence, but trying to maintain a veneer of civility. Robert is busy, she said without preamble. He asked me to call you about the Christmas situation. We've been thinking about your concerns, and we're willing to compromise. You can come to Christmas dinner at the cabin, just for the day itself. You'll need to stay at a hotel in town rather than at the cabin with us, because we really do need the space for immediate family, but you're welcome to join us for the meal. We thought that was a fair solution given everything. The audacity of it actually made me laugh, a short, sharp sound that clearly wasn't the response Patricia expected. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her recalibrating. I don't think that's funny, Lauren. We're trying to include you despite the complications your presence creates for Olivia. The least you could do is show some gratitude. I'm not laughing because it's funny, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm laughing because you seem to think there's still a Christmas at Lake Tahoe to invite me to. I canceled the reservation yesterday morning. There is no cabin. There is no catering. There is no Christmas at Tahoe. I paid for it, I was uninvited from it, so I canceled it. Simple as that. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear Patricia breathing, could almost feel her brain trying to process what I'd just said. When she spoke again, her voice had risen half an octave. You canceled it? The entire reservation? Do you have any idea how much planning went into this? How excited Olivia has been? How much Robert was looking forward to this? About as much planning as went into uninviting me after I paid for everything, I replied. And honestly, Patricia, I don't really care how excited anyone was. If you want to have Christmas at Lake Tahoe, feel free to book your own cabin and pay for it yourselves. I'm sure there are still some properties available, though probably not in the luxury range since you're booking so late. You're being incredibly selfish, she hissed. This isn't just about you, Lauren. This affects Jake. This affects our whole family. How are we supposed to explain this to everyone? I'm sure you'll figure something out, I said. You're very good at spinning narratives. Now if you'll excuse me, I have plans for the evening. Tell my father he can call me himself if he wants to discuss this further. I don't take instructions through intermediaries. I ended the call before she could respond, my heart hammering in my chest. My apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. I grabbed my coat and keys and went for a walk, letting the cold December rain soak through my jacket as I circled the blocks around my building. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket, call after call from Patricia's number, then Olivia's, then finally my father's. I ignored all of them. It wasn't until I was back home, changed into dry clothes with a cup of tea warming my hands, that I finally listened to the voicemails. Patricia's was predictably venomous, calling me spiteful and immature, accusing me of ruining Christmas out of petty revenge. Olivia's was shorter but equally hostile, calling me pathetic and suggesting I needed therapy for my obvious issues with their family. But it was my father's message that really cut. His voice was cold in a way I'd rarely heard, the tone he used to use when I was a teenager and had disappointed him in some fundamental way. Lauren, this is extremely concerning behavior. Canceling a family vacation because you didn't get your way is childish and vindictive. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this attitude needs to stop. You're acting like your mother did near the end. Always making everything about yourself, always playing the victim. Call me back so we can discuss this like adults, assuming you're capable of that. The comparison to my mother, dead for 14 years and unable to defend herself, hit like a physical blow. I sat there on my couch, tea forgotten, feeling the old familiar pattern trying to reassert itself. The guilt, the second-guessing, the voice that whispered maybe I had overreacted, maybe I was being unreasonable, maybe I should apologize and try to fix things. That voice had controlled me for most of my adult life, keeping me compliant and generous and perpetually hoping for crumbs of affection. But underneath that old programming, something new was hardening into place. Anger, yes, but more than that. Clarity. For the first time in my relationship with my father and his second family, I could see the dynamic with perfect transparency. I was useful when I was funding things, tolerable when I was quiet and undemanding, but ultimately disposable the moment my presence became inconvenient. And the worst part, the part that made my hands shake as I finally deleted all the voicemails, was that I'd been complicit in teaching them to treat me this way. Jake called just after 10, his voice tight with stress. Lauren, what's going on? Dad is losing his mind. He's yelling at Patricia. She's crying. Olivia locked herself in her room. They keep saying you canceled Christmas. Please tell me that's not true. It's true, I said gently. I canceled the Lake Tahoe reservation after Dad uninvited me. I'm not paying $8,000 for a vacation I'm not allowed to attend, Jake. Surely you can understand that. I do understand, he said quickly. Of course I do. What they did was horrible. But now Dad is saying there's no Christmas at all. And Patricia is talking about how humiliated she's going to be when her friends find out they had to cancel their plans. And it's just chaos here. I don't know what to do. The distress in his voice made my chest ache. Jake was caught in the middle of something he'd never asked to be part of, collateral damage in a war he was too young and too hopeful to have seen coming. You don't have to do anything, I told him. This isn't your fault, and it isn't your responsibility to fix. If Dad wants to have Christmas somewhere, he can arrange that himself. He's an adult with resources. The fact that he chose to rely on me funding everything and then treated me like I was disposable, that's on him, not you. Where are you going to be for Christmas? Jake asked, and the vulnerability in his question nearly broke me. I don't know yet, I admitted. Probably just here at home. Maybe Nicole will let me crash her family's celebration. Or maybe I'll just have a quiet day by myself. Honestly, Jake, that sounds better than what Lake Tahoe was going to be anyway. Can I come stay with you instead? The question came out in a rush, like he'd been holding it back and finally couldn't anymore. I don't want to be here if you're not going to be around. It doesn't feel like family anymore, Lauren. Maybe it never really did, and I just didn't want to see it. I closed my eyes, torn between wanting to protect him and knowing he needed to make his own choices about his relationship with our father. You can always come here, I said. You know that. But think carefully before you burn bridges with Dad. You're still dependent on him for a lot of things. College tuition, housing when you're not at school, health insurance. I don't want you to sacrifice your practical security because of my fight with him. This isn't just your fight though, is it? Jake's voice was steadier now, older somehow. This is about how they've always treated both of us. I just never wanted to admit it because I kept hoping things would change. But they won't, will they? Not really. Patricia is never going to see us as her real family. Olivia is never going to stop resenting that we exist. And Dad made his choice a long time ago about who matters more. The truth of it hung between us, heavy and undeniable. No, I said softly. They won't change. People don't change fundamental patterns unless they have a really compelling reason to do so. And we've never given them that reason. We've just kept accommodating and hoping. Then maybe it's time we stopped, Jake said. Maybe it's time we figured out what our family actually is instead of pretending to be part of theirs. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room for a long time, watching the lights of Portland blur through my rain-streaked windows. My phone continued to buzz with texts and calls, but I was done responding for the night. Let them stew in the consequences of their own choices. Let them scramble to salvage their Christmas plans. Let them feel a fraction of the panic and hurt and bewilderment I'd felt when my father casually uninvited me from the celebration I'd funded. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 34 text messages. Most were from Patricia and Olivia, variations on the same theme of outrage and accusation. But there was one from my Uncle Greg, my father's younger brother, that stood out from the rest. Lauren, your dad called me at midnight ranting about Lake Tahoe. His version of events doesn't add up. Call me when you get a chance. I'd like to hear your side. Uncle Greg had always been the family member who existed at a careful distance from the drama. He'd come to my mother's funeral and quietly slipped me a check for $1,000 with a note that said for whatever you need. He'd shown up at my college graduation when my father had been too busy with Patricia's family obligations. He'd sent Jake birthday cards with cash every year without fail. But he'd never directly intervened in the growing dysfunction of our family, never called out my father's favoritism or Patricia's coldness. I'd always assumed he just didn't care enough to get involved. I called him back during my lunch break, stepping out of the office into the cold December air. He answered on the first ring, his familiar gravelly voice warm with the same Oregon accent my father had mostly shed over the years. Lauren, sweetheart. Talk to me. What the hell happened? I told him everything, starting with the warm text from my father 3 weeks earlier, and ending with the voicemail comparing me to my dead mother. I kept my voice factual and level, laying out the timeline like I was presenting a financial analysis to a client. Uncle Greg listened without interrupting, and when I finished, the silence on his end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, and there was anger in his voice, but not at me. Your father is an idiot. I've bitten my tongue for years watching how he treats you and Jake, telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But this crosses a line. You paid for the whole trip and he uninvited you? Then got mad when you canceled? That's not just unfair, Lauren. That's abusive. There was that word again. Abusive. Hearing it from a man who'd known my father his whole life, who'd grown up with him and understood the family dynamics in ways I couldn't, made it feel more real somehow. More legitimate. I need you to know something, Uncle Greg continued. Your mother didn't make everything about herself. That voicemail your dad left, that comparison he made, that's complete garbage. Your mom was the most generous person I ever met, right up until she couldn't fight anymore. What your father is doing now, rewriting history to make you feel guilty, that's what's actually going on. He's projecting his own selfishness onto you and onto her memory. My eyes stung with sudden tears. I'd spent so many years wondering if maybe my father was right, if maybe I was too sensitive, too demanding, too much like some negative version of my mother that existed only in his mind. Hearing someone who'd actually known her well push back against that narrative cracked something open inside me. Thank you, I managed. I needed to hear that. What are you doing for Christmas? Uncle Greg asked. Because if you're free, you should come down to Reno. Nothing fancy, just me and a few friends, but you'd be welcome. Jake too if he wants to come. I've got plenty of space, and honestly, it would be good to spend the holiday with family who actually appreciates you. The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that for a moment I couldn't speak. When I finally found my voice, it came out rougher than I intended. I'd like that. I'll talk to Jake and see what he wants to do. Good, Uncle Greg said firmly. And Lauren? Don't you dare apologize to your father for standing up for yourself. You did the right thing. It's about time someone held him accountable for how he treats people. The days leading up to Christmas took on a surreal quality, like watching a storm approach from a safe distance. My phone became a constant source of chaos, buzzing with increasingly desperate and angry messages from Patricia, occasional guilt-laden attempts from my father, and surprisingly vicious attacks from Olivia, who seemed to take my cancellation as a personal insult to her entire existence. I stopped reading most of them after the first few, instead forwarding everything to a folder I titled Evidence, because some instinct told me I might need documentation of their behavior later. Work became my sanctuary during those strange December days. The office was quieter than usual with people taking vacation time, and I threw myself into year-end portfolio reviews with an intensity that had my colleagues eyeing me with concern. My manager, Patricia, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and no-nonsense attitude, pulled me aside on December 20th during a coffee break in the empty break room. You look like you're running from something, she observed, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. Want to talk about it, or should I just make sure you're not burning yourself out before the new year? I considered deflecting, but something about her directness made me want to be honest. Family trouble, I said simply. The kind where you realize you've been playing a rigged game for years, and you finally flipped the table. She nodded slowly, a knowing look crossing her face. Let me guess. You stood up for yourself, they didn't like it, and now you're the villain in their story instead of the person they'd been mistreating. The accuracy of her assessment startled me. How did you know? Because I've lived it, she said bluntly. Different details, same pattern. Took me until I was 40 to figure out that some people only value you for what you provide, not who you are. Walking away from that kind of toxicity feels terrible at first, like you're the one doing something wrong. But give it time. The relief comes later, once you stop waiting for them to suddenly become who you needed them to be. Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening through Portland's rain-slick streets, past houses already glowing with Christmas lights and inflatable yard decorations. Everywhere I looked, people seemed to be preparing for the holiday with an enthusiasm I couldn't muster. My own apartment remained undecorated, a conscious choice that felt both liberating and melancholy. What was the point of putting up a tree when I'd be spending Christmas in Reno with an uncle I barely knew? Fleeing from the family I'd tried so hard to belong to. Jake called that night, his voice hushed like he was hiding somewhere to talk. I told Dad I'm spending Christmas with you and Uncle Greg. He didn't take it well. Define didn't take it well, I said, though I could already imagine the scene. He called me ungrateful and said I was choosing sides against the family. Patricia said I was being manipulated by you and that I'd regret this when I'm older and understand what family loyalty really means. Olivia just rolled her eyes and said whatever, like she couldn't care less. But I heard her tell Patricia later that it's probably for the best since I'm just as problematic as you are anyway. The casual cruelty of it made my jaw tighten. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Are you okay? Do you have a way to get to my place? Or do you need me to come get you? I can get there, Jake said. I've got my car, and most of my stuff is already packed. I told Dad I'm leaving tomorrow morning. He said if I walk out that door, I shouldn't expect him to keep paying for school next semester. The threat hit me like ice water. My father was willing to sabotage Jake's education over this? I felt rage building in my chest, hot and sharp. Don't worry about tuition, I said immediately. I'll cover it if he actually follows through on that threat. He's bluffing, Jake. He has to be. But even if he's not, I won't let him destroy your future because he's angry at me. Lauren, I can't ask you to do that. That's like $20,000 a semester. You're not asking. I'm offering. You're my brother and I love you. And I'm not going to let Dad use your education as a weapon. We'll figure it out together, okay? Just pack your things and come here tomorrow. We'll drive down to Reno together and have an actual nice Christmas with someone who wants us there. After we hung up, I sat down at my laptop and pulled up my financial spreadsheets. $20,000 a semester was $40,000 a year if Jake needed support for both fall and spring. It would be tight, especially after losing the money from the Lake Tahoe cancellation, but I could make it work if I was careful. I'd been saving aggressively for years, building up an emergency fund that was supposed to be for buying a house someday. Protecting my brother's future seemed like a better use of that money than any down payment. My phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize with a Nevada area code. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was some telemarketer with terrible timing, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was female, older, with a warmth that immediately put me on guard because I'd learned not to trust unexpected kindness. Is this Lauren Mitchell? I'm calling from Evergreen Property Management in Lake Tahoe. My name is Amanda. We spoke about your cancellation last week. I hope I'm not bothering you, but something came up that I thought you should know about. My stomach dropped. Had my father somehow convinced them to reverse the cancellation? Was there some clause in the contract I'd missed that would force me to honor the reservation? Okay, I said cautiously. What's going on? Well, after we processed your cancellation, we had several inquiries about that particular property for the same dates. It's one of our most sought-after cabins, and Christmas week is obviously premium time. One family in particular was very eager to book it, and they asked if there was any way to contact the previous renter to perhaps work out a private arrangement. Normally we wouldn't pass along contact information, but the situation is a bit unusual. She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. The party inquiring about the cabin is listed under the name Robert Mitchell. The credit card on file for the booking attempt came back declined, which is why they reached out to us about contacting you. I'm calling because our policy is to verify whether you're related to this person before we proceed with any communication between parties. The audacity of it actually made me laugh, a genuine sound of disbelief that probably confused Amanda. My father had tried to book the same cabin I'd canceled, using his credit card that apparently didn't have enough available credit to cover the cost, and was now trying to reach me through the property management company to, what, ask me to pay for it again? Yes, I said when I could speak normally. Robert Mitchell is my father. And no, I absolutely do not want you to facilitate any communication between us. If he wants to book that cabin, he'll need to do so through normal channels and pay for it himself. Please don't give him my contact information, and please don't relay any messages from him to me. Understood completely, Amanda said, and I could hear the professionalism in her voice carefully masking what I suspected was fascination with the drama. I'll make a note in our system. For what it's worth, Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that your cancellation was processed correctly, and you don't owe us anything further. Some of my colleagues have been speculating about your situation, and we all agree you handled everything properly. The unexpected solidarity from a stranger made my throat tight. Thank you, I managed. I really appreciate you calling to let me know. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My father hadn't just been angry about my cancellation for emotional reasons. He'd been counting on that reservation existing, had apparently made plans and commitments based on the assumption that I'd continue to fund everything even after being uninvited. And when he discovered the reservation was gone, his solution hadn't been to apologize or try to make amends. It had been to attempt to rebook the same cabin, and presumably find a way to make me pay for it anyway. The sheer entitlement of it crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about Christmas or family dynamics or hurt feelings. This was about a fundamental belief system my father had developed over years where my resources were his to command. My boundaries were his to ignore, and my feelings were irrelevant as long as I continued to serve my function as the family ATM. And he'd apparently trained me so well to accept that role that he genuinely seemed shocked when I finally refused to play along. I forwarded Amanda's number to my own evidence folder, then sent a quick text to Uncle Greg letting him know that Jake and I would be arriving in Reno on the 23rd. His response came back almost immediately. Looking forward to it. Fair warning though, your dad called me tonight trying to get me to talk some sense into you. Told him where he could stick his sense. Might want to prepare for him to escalate before you leave town. The warning proved prescient. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, my building's security buzzer rang. The doorman's voice came through sounding apologetic. Ms. Mitchell, there's a Robert Mitchell here to see you. Says he's your father. Should I send him up? My heart rate spiked immediately. My father knew where I lived, obviously, but he'd never shown up unannounced before. The violation of that boundary felt deliberate. A power play designed to force a confrontation on his terms rather than mine. No, I said firmly. Please tell him I'm not available and ask him to leave. If he refuses, let me know and I'll call the police for trespassing. There was a pause, some muffled conversation I couldn't quite hear. Then the doorman came back on. He's leaving, but he asked me to give you a message. He says you're making a terrible mistake, and that you have 24 hours to fix this before he takes steps you'll regret. He didn't elaborate on what that means. Thank you for handling that, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Please make a note in the building log about this visit, and if he comes back, don't buzz my apartment. Just call the police immediately. I called in sick to work, something I almost never did, because the thought of leaving my apartment with my father potentially lurking somewhere nearby made my skin crawl. Instead, I spent the day packing for Reno, organizing my finances, and researching what legal steps I could take if my father actually followed through on whatever threat he was making. The phrase "steps you'll regret" kept circling through my mind, ominous in its vagueness. Nicole came over that afternoon with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, her teacher's instinct for when someone was spiraling working overtime. She took one look at my face when I opened the door, and immediately pulled me into a hug. Talk, she ordered. Everything. Don't leave anything out. I told her about my father's visit, about the attempted cabin booking, about the threat delivered through my doorman. I showed her my evidence folder, now containing dozens of texts and voicemails, each one more accusatory than the last. Nicole read through them with an increasingly dark expression, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Lauren, she said finally, setting my phone down with careful precision. This isn't normal family conflict. This is harassment. You need to document everything, and I mean everything. Dates, times, witnesses. You might need a restraining order if this keeps escalating. That seems extreme, I protested weakly, even though part of me knew she was right. Does it? Your father showed up at your home unannounced to deliver a veiled threat. He's attempting to manipulate property management companies to access you. He's threatening your brother's education. He's enlisting other family members to pressure you. That's not a concerned parent trying to resolve a misunderstanding. That's someone who's losing control and getting desperate. Her assessment was clinical and accurate, and it scared me because it meant acknowledging that this situation might be more dangerous than I'd realized. What steps could my father take that I'd regret? Was he vindictive enough to try to damage my professional reputation? Would he attempt to turn other family members against me more aggressively? The unknown was almost worse than any specific threat would have been. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the building made me jolt awake, convinced my father had somehow gotten past security. When morning finally came, gray and rain-soaked as always in Portland, I felt simultaneously exhausted and wired with nervous energy. Jake was supposed to arrive by noon, and we'd planned to drive to Reno that afternoon, getting there in time for a late dinner with Uncle Greg. Jake showed up at 11:30 with 2 duffel bags and a backpack, his eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept much either. The moment I opened the door, he dropped everything and hugged me hard enough to hurt. "Dad tried to take my car keys this morning," he said into my shoulder. "Said if I was choosing you over the family, I didn't deserve to drive a car he helped buy." I had to wait until he left for his morning coffee run, and then I just grabbed my stuff and left. I held him tighter, fury and protectiveness warring in my chest. "We're going to be okay," I promised, even though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "We're going to Reno, we're going to have a good Christmas, and we're going to figure out the rest after the holidays. One step at a time." We loaded his things into my car in the building's underground garage, both of us moving quickly like we expected my father to materialize at any moment. The drive to Reno was supposed to take about 9 hours with stops, a long haul through Oregon and into Nevada. As I pulled out of the garage and onto the wet Portland streets, I felt something loosen in my chest. Distance. Safety. The physical act of leaving felt like the first full breath I'd taken in days. Jake dozed in the passenger seat for the first few hours while I drove through familiar Oregon landscape, the rain gradually giving way to clearer skies as we climbed into higher elevations. My phone sat in the cup holder between us, silenced but not powered off, a tether I couldn't quite bring myself to cut. Around hour 3, somewhere between Bend and the California border, it started buzzing with an incoming call. Patricia's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, maybe the same instinct that had made me document everything else. I put it on speaker so Jake could hear. Patricia's voice filled the car, shrill and accusatory. "Where is Jake? Robert went to your apartment and the doorman said you'd both left. You can't just take him and disappear. He's still a minor in our care." "He's 19, I said calmly. "He's an adult who made his own choice about where to spend Christmas. And we didn't disappear. We're visiting family. You know, the kind of family that actually wants us around." "You're poisoning him against us," Patricia hissed. "You've always been jealous of what Robert and I have, jealous that he moved on from your mother. Jealous that Olivia is successful while you're just bitter and alone. This whole thing is pathetic, Lauren. Canceling Christmas like a spoiled child because you didn't get your way." "I canceled a reservation I paid for after being uninvited from the event," I corrected. "That's not being spoiled. That's having basic self-respect. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm driving and I don't have time for this conversation." "Robert wants to talk to you," Patricia said quickly, and I heard shuffling as the phone changed hands. My father's voice came through, and unlike Patricia's shrillness, his tone was carefully controlled. Dangerously calm. "Lauren, you need to understand something. I've been patient with your behavior, because I know you're struggling with some things. But taking Jake out of state without permission crosses a line. I've contacted my attorney, and he's advised me that this could constitute parental interference. You're not Jake's legal guardian. I am. And if you don't turn around and bring him back immediately, I'll be forced to take legal action." The threat was so absurd it actually made me laugh. "Jake is 19 years old, Dad. He can go wherever he wants. You have no legal authority over his movements. And threatening me with lawyers over a Christmas visit to Uncle Greg? That's a new low, even for you. This isn't about Christmas and you know it," my father said, his voice rising slightly despite his attempt at control. "This is about you undermining my authority, turning my son against me, and generally making my life as difficult as possible, because you can't handle that I've moved on with my life. Your mother had the same problem. She could never accept that the world didn't revolve around her feelings. There it was again, the comparison to my dead mother, the rewriting of history to paint me as the problem. But this time, instead of the words hitting their mark and making me doubt myself, they just made me angry. A clean, clear anger that sharpened my thoughts instead of muddying them. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice steady and cold. "I'm done. I'm done trying to earn your approval. I'm done funding your lifestyle. I'm done pretending that Patricia and Olivia are family just because you married into their dysfunction. And I'm especially done listening to you trash Mom's memory to manipulate me. She deserved better than you, and so do Jake and I. Don't call me again unless you're ready to apologize, and honestly, I'm not holding my breath." I ended the call and immediately blocked both my father's and Patricia's numbers. The silence that followed felt enormous, Like I'd just severed something that had been tethering me to the ground my whole life. Jake was staring at me with wide eyes, somewhere between shocked and proud. "That was amazing," he said quietly. "I've never heard you talk to him like that." "I didn't know you could." "Neither did I admitted. My hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline making my whole body feel electric. "But it's done now. Whatever happens next, at least I finally said what I've been thinking for years." We drove in silence for a while after that, both of us processing what had just happened. The landscape outside changed gradually from Oregon forest to high desert, the sky opening up into that vast Nevada blue that makes you feel small and free at the same time. My phone stayed quiet, the blocked calls creating a bubble of peace that felt fragile but real. Uncle Greg called around 4 o'clock, just as we were passing through Winnemucca. His voice was warm and concerned. "Just wanted to check where you're at. Also wanted to warn you that your father called me again. Apparently he's planning to file some kind of police report about Jake being taken against his will. It's complete nonsense legally speaking, but he seems determined to make trouble." "Let him," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "Jake is an adult. We have text messages and witnesses proving he chose to come with me. And my father is just making himself look unhinged. If he wants to waste police resources on a false report, that's his problem." "That's the spirit," Uncle Greg said approvingly. "See you in a few hours. I've got the guest room all set up, and I picked up some good steaks for dinner. Figure we can have a proper meal and forget about all this drama for a while." The last few hours of driving passed more easily. Jake woke up fully and we talked about school, his classes, the girl he'd been seeing casually but wasn't sure about. Normal things. Brother and sister things. The kind of conversation that had nothing to do with family drama or money or whose side anyone was on. By the time we pulled into Reno as the sun was setting, painting the desert mountains in shades of orange and purple, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Uncle Greg's house was a modest ranch style in an older neighborhood, the kind of place that looked lived in and comfortable rather than impressive. He came out to meet us as we pulled into the driveway, a stocky man in his 50s with my father's features, but a completely different energy. Where my father always seemed tense and judgmental, Uncle Greg radiated an easy warmth that immediately put me at ease. He hugged Jake first, then pulled me into an embrace that lasted long enough to feel genuinely meaningful. "Welcome," he said simply. "Both of you. I'm glad you're here." Uncle Greg's house smelled like wood smoke and coffee, a combination that immediately made me feel more at home than I'd felt in years at my father's pristine, Patricia-controlled residence. The interior was comfortable in that distinctly masculine way of a man who'd lived alone for decades, practical furniture arranged for function rather than aesthetics, walls covered with framed photos of classic cars and family snapshots from better times. I noticed immediately that several of the photos featured my mother, images I hadn't seen in years because Patricia had systematically removed every trace of her from my father's life. Jake noticed them too, stopping in front of a picture of our mother at what looked like a 4th of July barbecue. Her smile bright and genuine, her arm around a much younger version of Uncle Greg. "Is that Mom?" he asked softly, and I realized with a pang that he barely remembered what she looked like beyond the few photos I'd managed to save. "That's your mom," Uncle Greg confirmed, coming to stand beside us. "That was taken at my place, actually about a year before she got sick. Best potato salad I ever tasted in my life. She made it from scratch that day. Your dad was supposed to man the grill, but he got caught up in a phone call about some job, so she took over. Turned out perfect, of course. Everything she touched usually did." The casual way he talked about her, like she was a real person with quirks and talents rather than just a tragic figure or a weapon to use in arguments, made something in my chest crack open. "When did you stop talking to Dad about her?" I asked. "Because he never mentions her anymore. It's like she never existed." Uncle Greg's expression darkened. "Right around the time he married Patricia. She made it clear she didn't want competition from a ghost, and your dad just went along with it. Boxed up the past like it was clutter instead of his children's history. I tried talking to him about it once. Told him Jake especially needed to remember his mother, but he said I didn't understand what it was like to move forward. Like remembering the people we love is somehow the same as being stuck." We had dinner that night around Uncle Greg's kitchen table. Nothing fancy, Just perfectly grilled steaks and baked potatoes and a salad that came from a bag, but tasted better than any elaborate meal Patricia had ever served. The conversation flowed easily, Uncle Greg asking Jake about college and his plans for the future, asking me about work and whether I liked living in Portland. Normal questions. No loaded comments about my life choices or comparisons to Olivia's supposed achievements or subtle digs at my relationship status. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed with a notification. I'd unblocked my father's number out of curiosity, wanting to see if he'd actually follow through on his police report threat. The message wasn't from him though. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The text contained a photo of my apartment building with a timestamp from earlier that evening, and a message that read, "You can run, but this doesn't end until you make this right. Stop being selfish and think about your family." I must have made some sound because both Uncle Greg and Jake looked up immediately. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. I showed them the phone, watching their expressions shift from confusion to anger. "That's harassment," Uncle Greg said flatly. "Pure and simple. You need to save that. Take it to the police, get it documented. I don't care if it's your father or someone he put up to it. That's not okay." "I don't even know who sent it," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "The number's not in my contacts." Uncle Greg pulled out his own phone and typed something quickly. "Give me the number. I know a guy who can run it. Figure out whose phone it is. Might take a day or two, but we'll find out." The rest of dinner was subdued, the earlier warmth replaced by a tension none of us had wanted to bring to the table. After we cleaned up, Uncle Greg showed us to the guest room, a simple space with 2 twin beds and a window overlooking his backyard. Before he left us for the night, he paused in the doorway, his expression serious. "I want you both to know something," he said. "What your father's doing right now, this isn't grief or concern or even anger. This is about control. He's realizing he can't manipulate you anymore, Lauren, and it's making him desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. So I need you to promise me that if anything else happens, anything that feels off or threatening, you tell me immediately. I don't care what time it is. Understood?" We both nodded, and after he left, Jake and I sat on our respective beds in silence for a long moment. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice small in a way that reminded me he was still just 19. Still so young despite trying to be brave. "Do you think Dad would actually hurt us? Like physically?" The question hung in the air, terrible in its implications. I wanted to say no immediately, to reassure him that our father would never cross that line. But the truth was I didn't know anymore. The man who'd shown up at my apartment building, who'd threatened legal action over nothing, who'd tried to manipulate property managers and send harassing photos, that man felt like a stranger wearing my father's face. "I don't think so," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "But I think he might do things to try to hurt us in other ways. Financially, professionally, socially. We need to be prepared for that and protect ourselves accordingly." That night I lay awake long after Jake's breathing had evened out into sleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how thoroughly my life had changed in just 3 weeks. A month ago, I'd been eagerly planning a Christmas that I thought would finally bring our fractured family together. I'd believed that generosity and sacrifice could build bridges over years of hurt. Now I was hiding in my uncle's guest room in Reno, blocking harassing messages, and wondering what my father might do next. My phone buzzed again around midnight. Another unknown number, another message. This one was worse than the photo. It was a screenshot of my LinkedIn profile with the caption, "Would be a shame if your employer knew how you treat your family. Professional reputation is everything in finance, isn't it?" The threat was clear and chilling. My father, or whoever he'd enlisted to help him, was prepared to try to damage my career. I took screenshots of everything, backed them up to cloud storage, and then did something I'd been avoiding. I drafted an email to HR at my firm, explaining in clinical, professional language that I was experiencing a family situation that might result in false complaints or harassment directed at the company. I didn't send it, not yet, but having it ready felt like at least I was taking some control back. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the Nevada sun bright enough to hurt after Portland's perpetual gray. Uncle Greg made pancakes for breakfast, and we spent the morning in a kind of determined normalcy, watching old movies and avoiding our phones. Around noon, Uncle Greg's contact called back about the number that had sent the threatening messages. The phone was registered to Olivia. The revelation shouldn't have shocked me, but it did. My stepsister, who'd always treated Jake and me with casual disdain but never outright hostility, had been recruited into my father's campaign of harassment. Or maybe she'd volunteered, eager to prove her loyalty to the family that actually mattered. Either way, it added another layer of betrayal to an already complicated situation. I showed Uncle Greg the threatening message about my employer. His face went hard in a way I'd never seen before. "That's it," he said. "We're done playing defense. Your father wants to escalate? Fine. Let's show him what happens when he pushes too far." He made a phone call that lasted about 20 minutes, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite hear from the living room. When he came back, he looked grimly satisfied. "I've got a lawyer friend who specializes in harassment cases. She's willing to meet with us tomorrow, Christmas Day, because she's also got family issues and would rather work than deal with her in-laws. We're going to document everything, get a restraining order process started, and send a cease and desist letter to your father, Patricia, and Olivia. If they want to play games, they're going to find out real fast that there are consequences." The idea of taking legal action against my own father felt surreal and frightening, but also somehow right. I'd spent so long trying to preserve a relationship that had been broken long before I'd canceled any Christmas plans. Maybe it was time to stop protecting people who'd never protected me. That afternoon, Jake and I went for a walk around Uncle Greg's neighborhood, needing to move and breathe and process everything that was happening. The streets were quiet, most people already gathered with their families for Christmas Eve celebrations. We passed houses with lights twinkling and wreaths on doors, and I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the family I'd wanted but never really had. Relief that I was finally free of the obligation to keep pretending. Jake was quiet for most of the walk, but as we turned back toward Uncle Greg's house, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said before about maybe Dad using my tuition as a weapon. I don't want you to have to pay for school if he cuts me off. That's not fair to you." I stopped walking and turned to face him, putting my hands on his shoulders so he had to look at me. "Jake, listen to me. You are my brother and I love you. If Dad decides to be vindictive and cruel enough to sabotage your education because you chose to spend Christmas with me, that's on him, not you. And I'm not going to let his pettiness ruin your future. I have the money. It'll be tight, but I can make it work. You focus on your studies and becoming the person you want to be. Let me worry about the logistics." His eyes filled with tears, and he pulled me into a hug that reminded me of all the times I'd comforted him as a kid when he'd scraped his knee or had a nightmare. Except now we were both adults, both trying to navigate a situation that shouldn't have been this hard. Family shouldn't feel like a battlefield. Love shouldn't come with so many conditions and threats. We spent Christmas Eve evening at Uncle Greg's house in comfortable quiet. He'd invited a few neighbors over for drinks and cookies, people who'd known him for years and who accepted Jake and me without question or judgment. One woman, Margaret, who lived 2 houses down, had apparently heard some version of our story from Uncle Greg. She cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling my glass of wine, and spoke with the blunt kindness of someone who'd lived through her own family drama. "My daughter didn't talk to me for 5 years, she said without preamble. I'd said some things I shouldn't have when she came out as gay. Took me way too long to realize I was wrong. And by the time I tried to apologize, she'd built a whole life without me in it. You know what I learned from that? Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're family. Especially if they're family. Blood doesn't give anyone the right to treat you like garbage." Her words, coming from someone who'd been on the other side of family estrangement, hit differently than all of Nicole's well-meaning support or Uncle Greg's righteous anger. This was someone who understood the cost of broken families from the perspective of the person who'd done the breaking, and she was still validating my choice to protect myself. That night, lying in the twin bed in Uncle Greg's guest room, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt and second-guessing that had been my constant companions for weeks began to recede, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. I'd done everything I could to maintain a relationship with my father. I'd been generous past the point of self-preservation. I'd given him chance after chance to choose me, to see me, to value me beyond what I could provide financially. And he'd failed every single test. Christmas morning came with a knock on the bedroom door and Uncle Greg's voice calling that he'd made coffee and cinnamon rolls. Jake and I emerged to find the living room transformed in small ways. A modest tree in the corner that hadn't been there the night before. A few wrapped presents underneath it. Uncle Greg looked almost embarrassed when we noticed. Couldn't let Christmas pass without something, he said gruffly. Nothing fancy, just a few things I thought you might like. The gifts were thoughtful in a way that made my throat tight. For Jake, a nice leather portfolio for school with his initials embossed on it, and a framed photo of him with our mother that I'd never seen before. For me, a beautiful journal bound in soft leather, and a copy of our mother's recipe book that I'd thought was lost forever. Uncle Greg had apparently saved it when my father had cleared out the storage unit, keeping it safe all these years. I thought you might want that, he said as I ran my fingers over my mother's handwriting on the first page. She was always writing down recipes, tweaking them, making notes about what worked and what didn't. Seemed wrong for those to just disappear. We spent Christmas morning in pajamas, drinking coffee and eating cinnamon rolls and sharing stories about my mother that Jake had never heard. Uncle Greg had a gift for remembering the small details that made her real. The way she'd sing off-key while cooking, her terrible sense of direction, her competitive streak during family game nights. Jake absorbed every story like he was starving for them. And I realized how much my father had stolen from him by erasing her memory so thoroughly. Around noon, Uncle Greg's lawyer friend arrived. Diana Chin was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately inspired confidence. She sat at Uncle Greg's dining table with her laptop and a legal pad, listening as I walked her through everything that had happened, starting with the initial invitation to Christmas and ending with the threatening messages about my employer. She took notes methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back and studied me for a moment. You have an extremely strong case for a restraining order, she said. The pattern of escalating harassment is well documented, and the threat to interfere with your employment crosses several legal lines. I can have the paperwork filed by tomorrow morning. The question is whether you're prepared for what happens next. What do you mean? I asked. She folded her hands on the table, her expression serious. Restraining orders are public record. Once you file this, your father and stepmother will be served with papers, likely by a sheriff's deputy. They'll be ordered to stay away from you and cease all contact. This will probably enrage them further before it gets better. There may be mutual friends or extended family who take their side, who see you as the aggressor. You need to be prepared for your social circle to potentially fracture over this. I thought about the family members I barely saw anymore, the cousins and aunts and uncles who'd drifted away over the years, or who'd always seemed more aligned with my father's version of events. The truth was I didn't have much to lose socially. My real support system was small but solid: Nicole, Uncle Greg, a few colleagues at work who'd become friends. Everyone else was window dressing. I'm prepared, I said. Whatever happens, it can't be worse than what's already happening. Diana nodded approvingly. Good. I'll get the paperwork started this afternoon. I'll also draft cease and desist letters to your father, stepmother, and stepsister. Those will go out via certified mail and email, creating a paper trail. Additionally, I'd recommend you send that email to your HR department sooner rather than later. Get ahead of any potential false complaints. We spent the next hour going over details, Diana asking questions about my employment contract, my lease agreement, my financial entanglements with my father. It turned out the $5,000 loan I'd given him for the truck down payment 3 years ago was technically recoverable if I wanted to pursue it. Especially since we'd exchanged text messages about it being a loan rather than a gift. I hadn't even remembered those texts existed until Diana asked if I had any written communication about the money. By the time Diana left, promising to have everything filed and sent by December 26th, I felt wrung out but also strangely empowered. I was taking concrete action instead of just reacting to whatever my father threw at me next. I was setting boundaries with legal backing. I was protecting not just myself but also Jake, who'd been pulled into this mess through no fault of his own. That evening, the three of us had a proper Christmas dinner, Uncle Greg's promised steaks cooked to perfection with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. We opened a bottle of wine that Uncle Greg had been saving for a special occasion, and for a few hours, we managed to forget about everything happening outside these walls. Jake told stories about his college roommates and their disastrous attempts at cooking. Uncle Greg shared updates about his auto repair business and the classic Mustang he was restoring in his garage. I talked about a particularly difficult client at work who'd made me want to quit finance and become a park ranger. It was the kind of Christmas I'd been chasing for years without realizing it. Not perfect or Instagram-worthy or impressive. Just real, with people who genuinely wanted to be together, who didn't need grand gestures or expensive settings to enjoy each other's company. No one was keeping score of who'd brought what or contributed how much. No one was being compared to anyone else or found wanting. We were just three people sharing a meal and building the kind of memories that actually mattered. My phone stayed silent all evening, and I chose to interpret that as my father and his family finally backing off. It was a naive hope, as I'd discovered the next morning, but for that one Christmas night, I let myself believe that maybe the worst was over. December 26th dawned with a flurry of text messages. Not from my father but from several extended family members I rarely heard from. My Aunt Susan, my father's older sister, sent a long message about how disappointed she was in my behavior, how I was tearing the family apart over petty grudges. My cousin Michelle, who I hadn't spoken to in probably 5 years, sent a shorter but no less judgmental text about how I should be ashamed of myself for attacking my father during the holidays. 3 more similar messages came from various relatives, all with the same theme. I was the villain, my father was the victim, and I needed to apologize and make things right. It was clearly a coordinated campaign, my father rallying whatever family support he could muster to pressure me into backing down. What he didn't know was that Diana had already filed the restraining order paperwork that morning, and the cease and desist letters were being sent via email with red receipts. By lunchtime, I'd know exactly when each recipient opened their legal warning. Uncle Greg saw me scrolling through the messages and shook his head. Block them all. Every single one. Anyone who's willing to attack you without even asking for your side of the story isn't worth your time or emotional energy. He was right, of course, but blocking family members felt like crossing yet another line, admitting that these relationships were unsalvageable. I did it anyway, watching names disappear from my contact list one by one, each deletion both painful and freeing. The email notifications from Diana's cease and desist letters started coming through around 2 in the afternoon. My father opened his at 2:17. Patricia opened hers at 2:23. Olivia didn't open hers until almost 6 that evening, but when she did, the response was immediate. My phone, which I'd stupidly forgotten to block her alternative numbers from, exploded with messages. The texts were unhinged, all caps screaming about lawsuits and lies and how dare I try to destroy her family. She called me every vile name she could apparently think of, threatened to post our entire family drama on social media, promised that I'd regret this for the rest of my life. I screenshot everything, sent it immediately to Diana, and then finally blocked every possible number associated with Olivia. Diana's response to the screenshots was swift and professional. This is perfect. She just violated the cease and desist within hours of receiving it. That's going to look great in front of a judge. Keep documenting everything, but stop reading the messages if you can. Let them incriminate themselves without it affecting your mental health. That evening, Uncle Greg suggested we go out for dinner, get out of the house and away from phones and legal drama for a few hours. We went to a local steakhouse that he swore had the best prime rib in Nevada, and for a couple of hours, we focused on normal conversation and good food. But my mind kept drifting back to what was happening, to my father somewhere receiving legal papers, to Patricia and Olivia spiraling in their anger, to the family members who'd turned against me without hesitation. When we got back to Uncle Greg's house, there was a voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I listened to it. My father's voice came through, but it was different from any tone I'd heard from him before. Not angry or cold or manipulative. Broken. Lauren, it's Dad. I got the papers today. The restraining order, the cease and desist, all of it. I don't understand how we got here. I know I made mistakes, I know I should have handled Christmas differently, but this feels like you're trying to erase me from your life entirely. Is that really what you want? To have no father at all? Because that's what this feels like. I'm asking you, please, can we talk? Just talk, no lawyers, no Patricia, just you and me. I think we owe each other that much after everything. The voicemail ended, and I sat there in Uncle Greg's driveway staring at my phone. Jake had already gone inside, but Uncle Greg was still sitting in the driver's seat, watching me with concern. You okay? He asked. I played him the voicemail. When it finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That's bait, he said finally. He's trying to pull you back in, make you feel guilty, get you to drop the legal protections you just put in place. Don't fall for it. I know, I said. But part of me wonders if he actually means it. If maybe getting served with legal papers shocked him into realizing how badly he screwed up. Uncle Greg's expression was sympathetic but firm. Lauren, I've known my brother for 58 years. He's not going to change. He might feel sorry for himself right now. Might even believe he wants to make things right. But the second you drop your guard, the second you give him an opening, he'll go right back to the same patterns. Because that's who he is. That's who he's been since your mother died. And he decided moving on meant erasing her, and emotionally abandoning you and Jake. The truth of it settled over me like a weight. I wanted to believe in redemption and growth and the possibility that people could change when confronted with consequences. But Uncle Greg was right. My father had been given countless chances to choose differently, to see me as more than a resource or a disappointment. And every single time, he'd chosen his new life with Patricia, his comfort, his pride, his need to be right over any meaningful connection with his daughter. I'm not going to call him back, I said finally. The restraining order stands. The cease and desist stands. If he actually wants to make amends, he can do the work in therapy, examine his behavior, and maybe in a year or two, we can revisit whether there's anything to salvage. But I'm done being the one who sacrifices everything to maintain a relationship that only flows one direction. Uncle Greg reached over and squeezed my shoulder. I'm proud of you. Your mom would be proud of you too. You're finally putting yourself first, and that's exactly what you need to do. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange limbo. The restraining order was approved by a judge on December 28th, and according to Diana, my father had been served the papers at his house on the 29th. There were no more direct communications from him or Patricia or Olivia after that, though the family campaign against me continued on social media. Several relatives posted vague things about family loyalty and forgiveness, clearly directed at me without naming me specifically. I stayed off social media entirely, letting their narrative spin without my participation. Jake and I spent those days helping Uncle Greg with projects around his house, reorganizing his garage and helping him work on the Mustang restoration. The physical work was therapeutic, giving us something concrete to focus on while the legal and emotional drama unfolded in the background. Jake was quieter than usual, processing everything in his own way, but he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of trying to please everyone and maintain impossible family dynamics. On New Year's Eve, Uncle Greg threw a small party with the same neighbors who'd come over on Christmas Eve, plus a few friends from his auto shop. It was low-key and warm, people playing cards and sharing stories and counting down to midnight with champagne that probably cost $10 a bottle, but tasted perfect in that moment. When the clock struck 12 and everyone cheered, I looked around at these people who'd welcomed Jake and me without question, and I realized something important. Family wasn't blood or legal ties or shared last names. Family was the people who showed up when things got hard, who accepted you without conditions, who celebrated your boundaries instead of demanding you erase them. Uncle Greg was more family than my father had been in over a decade. Nicole, back in Portland, was more family than Patricia and Olivia would ever be. Even Margaret from 2 houses down, with her blunt wisdom about estrangement and healing, had offered more genuine care in one conversation than I'd received from most of my blood relatives in years. Jake and I returned to Portland on January 2nd, the drive back feeling completely different from the anxious flight to Reno less than 2 weeks earlier. We talked about the future, about Jake's upcoming semester, and whether he wanted to transfer to a school in Portland so we could be closer. We talked about what we'd do if my father actually followed through on his threat to cut off tuition funding. We talked about the memories Uncle Greg had shared about our mother, about keeping her alive in the stories we told, and the traditions we chose to maintain. When we pulled up to my apartment building, I felt a flutter of anxiety about what might be waiting for me. More threatening messages? Evidence that my father had tried to contact my employer despite the legal warnings? But there was nothing. Just my apartment exactly as I'd left it, my mail stacked neatly by the building manager. Everything normal and unthrottled by drama. Jake stayed with me for another week before heading back to school. We established new traditions in those days, cooking meals from our mother's recipe book, watching old movies she'd loved, talking about her freely without the weight of my father's disapproval hanging over us. On the day Jake left for school, he hugged me in my apartment doorway and said something that made everything worthwhile. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to choose yourself." I spent so long thinking I had to earn Dad's love by being whoever he wanted me to be. But watching you stand up for both of us, seeing you refuse to accept being treated badly just because someone shares your DNA, that taught me more than anything else could have. I'm going to remember that. The spring semester started, and my father didn't cut off Jake's tuition. I suspected Uncle Greg had something to do with that, some conversation with his brother that emphasized just how badly my father's reputation would suffer if he actually followed through on such vindictive threats. Or maybe my father had finally done the math and realized that alienating both his children completely wasn't the legacy he wanted. Either way, Jake stayed in school, and I kept the money I'd set aside as a backup plan. Work became busy as the new year ramped up, and I threw myself into it with renewed focus. The email I'd sent to HR before Christmas had been noted, and when no false complaints ever materialized, my manager commented that I'd handled a difficult personal situation with impressive professionalism. My reputation at the firm, which I'd worried might be damaged by my father's threats, actually seemed stronger than before. Nicole and I had dinner one evening in late January, catching up over Thai food and wine. She studied me across the table and finally said what she'd clearly been thinking for weeks. "You look different. Lighter somehow. Like you've been carrying around weight you finally put down." She wasn't wrong. The constant anxiety about my father's approval, the guilt over never being enough, the exhausting work of maintaining relationships with people who fundamentally didn't value me, all of that had been so heavy for so long that I hadn't even realized how much energy it consumed until it was gone. I wasn't happy about how things had ended, wasn't celebrating the fracture of my family, but I also wasn't drowning anymore. I could breathe. By Valentine's Day, enough time had passed that I started thinking about the future rather than just surviving the present. I looked at houses online, considering whether it was time to buy rather than rent. I signed up for a cooking class, wanting to expand beyond my mother's recipes and develop my own relationship with food. I started therapy, working with someone who specialized in family estrangement and complex trauma, unpacking years of patterns and healing old wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding. The restraining order was set to expire in 6 months, and Diana asked if I wanted to extend it. I thought about it carefully, weighing whether I was still in danger of harassment or whether enough time had passed for everyone to move on. In the end, I decided not to extend it. Not because I wanted to reconcile with my father, but because I wanted to test whether I'd actually healed enough that his potential contact wouldn't devastate me. The order expired in late June, and my father called exactly 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail, listening to it later with my therapist sitting across from me, ready to process whatever emotions came up. His voice was tentative, awkward in a way I'd never heard from him. He talked about the weather and Jake's graduation that had happened the week before, an event I'd attended and my father had skipped. He mentioned maybe getting coffee sometime if I was willing. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what had happened beyond a vague reference to things being difficult last Christmas. He ended by saying he hoped I was doing well. My therapist asked how I felt listening to it. I sat with the question, examining my emotional response carefully. What I felt was mostly indifference. No spike of hope that maybe this time would be different. No rage at his casual dismissal of everything he'd done. Just a kind of neutral observation that my father was still exactly who he'd always been. And I'd finally accepted that reality completely. I never called him back. Not out of spite or punishment, but simply because I didn't need to. I'd built a life that worked without his involvement, surrounded myself with people who valued me without conditions, and learned that love shouldn't require constant sacrifice and boundary erosion. If my father wanted a relationship with me someday, he'd need to do significantly more work than a casual voicemail could accomplish. And if he never did that work, I'd already grieved the father I'd wanted and made peace with the one I actually had. Jake graduated with honors that spring, and Uncle Greg and I were both there cheering him on. We took him out to dinner afterward, the three of us, and talked about his plans for graduate school and whether he'd stay on the West Coast or try something completely different. No one mentioned that my father and Patricia hadn't attended, that Olivia hadn't sent so much as a card. Their absence was noted but not mourned. We'd all moved forward. That summer, I bought a house in Portland's suburbs, a small bungalow with a garden I had no idea how to maintain, but was excited to learn about. Jake helped me move in, along with Nicole and Uncle Greg, who drove up from Reno with a truck full of furniture he'd been storing that had belonged to our mother. We spent the weekend unpacking and arranging furniture and filling the house with laughter and stories. On the last evening, Uncle Greg raised a beer and made a toast. To chosen family. To second chances. And to having the courage to walk away from people who can't appreciate what they have until it's gone. We clinked our bottles together. And I looked around at these people who'd shown up for me when it mattered most. And I knew with absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice. Not just in canceling the Lake Tahoe Christmas, though that had been the catalyst for everything else, but in choosing to value myself enough to demand better treatment, to enforce boundaries even when it was hard, and to build a family based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. The $8,600 I'd spent and lost felt like the best investment I'd ever made. Not because of what it bought, a canceled vacation that never happened, but because of what it revealed. It had stripped away the comfortable lies I'd been telling myself about family loyalty and unconditional love, and shown me the transactional reality underneath. And in destroying those illusions, it had freed me to build something real. My father tried reaching out a few more times over the following months, always surface-level attempts at connection that required nothing of him and everything of me. I responded occasionally with brief, polite texts that maintained distance while not being cruel. I sent a card for his birthday. I replied when he texted about Jake's achievements. But I never agreed to meet for coffee or talk on the phone. Never opened the door to the kind of relationship he seemed to want where we pretended the past hadn't happened. And I went back to being the daughter who funded things and absorbed criticism without complaint. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, I'd stopped thinking about my father daily, or even weekly. He'd become someone I used to know well, a person who existed in my past but didn't shape my present. Uncle Greg invited Jake and me back to Reno for the holidays, and we went gladly, establishing new traditions that had nothing to do with expensive cabins or catered meals or proving our worth through grand gestures. We spent Christmas morning in pajamas again, ate cinnamon rolls again, shared new stories about our mother that Uncle Greg had remembered. We went to a local shelter and volunteered serving dinner on Christmas Day, something Jake had suggested because he wanted to spend the holiday helping people who actually needed it rather than trying to impress people who didn't appreciate it. That evening, exhausted and full of a different kind of satisfaction than any luxury vacation could have provided, we collapsed on Uncle Greg's couch and watched classic movies until we all fell asleep. It was perfect. Not in a polished, photogenic way that would impress anyone on social media, but in the real, messy, genuine way that actually matters. We were together by choice rather than obligation. We were building memories based on shared values rather than expensive props. And we were free from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who'd made it clear love wasn't actually what they were offering. That second Christmas, a year after everything had fallen apart and forced me to rebuild, I finally understood what the holidays were supposed to feel like. Not performing gratitude while swallowing hurt. Not bankrupting yourself to prove your worth. Not pretending broken things were fine, because acknowledging the truth felt too risky. Just being present with people who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. Who celebrated your existence without requiring you to earn it. Who understood that love without respect isn't actually love at all. I never regretted canceling that Lake Tahoe Christmas. Not for a single moment. Because in losing the family I'd been desperately clinging to, I'd found the family I actually needed. And that trade, $8,600 and a lifetime of misplaced hope for clarity and freedom and genuine connection, turned out to be the bargain of my life. The spring after that second Christmas brought unexpected changes that I hadn't anticipated. Jake decided to transfer to Portland State University for his final 2 years of undergraduate work, citing better opportunities in his major, but really, we both knew, wanting to be closer to the family that actually functioned. He moved into my spare bedroom in early March, and suddenly my quiet bungalow became filled with the chaos of a college student. Textbooks scattered across the dining table, his music drifting through the walls, the refrigerator constantly in need of restocking. It was the kind of chaos I'd never experienced growing up. After our mother died, my father's house under Patricia's control had been rigidly organized. Everything in its designated place, silence preferred over the messy noise of actual living. Having Jake around, sprawled on my couch complaining about his professors or cooking elaborate midnight snacks while studying for exams, felt like finally getting to experience the sibling relationship we'd been denied for so many years. One evening in April, while we were both working at the kitchen table, me reviewing client portfolios and Jake writing a paper on environmental policy, he looked up suddenly and asked a question that caught me off guard. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't canceled Lake Tahoe? Like if you'd just swallowed it and gone anyway, or if you'd stayed home quietly without making waves? I set down my pen and really considered the question. It was something I'd thought about occasionally in the quiet moments, running alternative timelines through my mind like financial projections with different variables. If I'd gone to Lake Tahoe after being uninvited, I probably would have spent the entire trip feeling invisible and diminished, watching Patricia and Olivia receive the attention and celebration while Jake and I existed in the margins. I would have spent $8,600 to feel unwanted in an expensive setting instead of an everyday one. And if I'd stayed home quietly? If I'd just canceled without telling anyone, absorbed the financial loss and pretended everything was fine? I would have taught them that they could treat me however they wanted without consequences. That my boundaries were negotiable. That I'd always be available to fund their lives while accepting whatever scraps of acknowledgement they felt like tossing my way. I would have stayed stuck in that pattern forever, getting smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely. I think I'd be miserable, I finally answered. Still trapped in that cycle of hoping things would change while doing nothing to actually change them. Still believing that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, proved my worth enough, Dad would suddenly become the father I needed. And you'd probably still be stuck there too, trying to please people who were never going to be pleased. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing this. I'm glad you did it then. Canceled everything, I mean. Even though it was scary and messy and kind of blew up our whole family structure. Because this, he gestured around the kitchen, at the two of us working companionably in a house we'd made into a home. This is better. This is what family should actually feel like. His words stayed with me through the following weeks as I navigated the continuing aftermath of choices I'd made over a year ago. Because the truth was that consequences didn't end neatly after a few months. They rippled outward, touching aspects of life I hadn't anticipated, forcing continued choices and adjustments and growth. In May, I received a wedding invitation from a cousin on my father's side, someone I'd grown up with but hadn't spoken to much in recent years. The invitation was addressed only to me, pointedly not including a +1, and came with a handwritten note explaining that both my father and I had been invited, but they hoped we could be civil for the sake of the celebration. The note was sympathetic but also clearly exhausting, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person with legitimate grievances. I almost declined immediately, not wanting to spend an entire day navigating the minefield of family members who'd taken my father's side, or who simply wanted everyone to pretend nothing had happened. But Jake pointed out that avoiding every family event forever meant letting my father's choices control my life as much as accommodating them had. If I wanted to see certain relatives, to maintain any connection to my extended family, I couldn't hide forever. So I RSVP'd yes, and spent the next 6 weeks mentally preparing myself with my therapist for what would essentially be my first public appearance in front of the family since everything had fallen apart. We role-played responses to potential confrontations, discussed strategies for managing my anxiety, and established clear boundaries about when I'd leave if things became too uncomfortable. My therapist reminded me repeatedly that I didn't owe anyone explanations or justifications, that I could simply exist at this wedding without performing remorse I didn't feel. The wedding was in early July, held at a vineyard in Oregon's wine country about 2 hours from Portland. I drove there alone, having declined Jake's offer to come with me, because I didn't want him to face the family firing squad on my behalf. The venue was beautiful in that effortless way that expensive outdoor weddings achieve. String lights already hung for the evening reception. Rows of white chairs arranged on the lawn, flowers everywhere. I arrived early, hoping to avoid the pre-ceremony mingling, but that strategy backfired when I ran into my Aunt Susan in the parking lot. She'd been one of the family members who'd sent me a scathing text after the Lake Tahoe cancellation, accusing me of tearing the family apart. We hadn't spoken since. She stopped when she saw me, her expression flickering through several emotions too quickly to identify. For a long moment, we just stood there in the gravel parking lot, the summer heat making the air shimmer, the sound of other guests arriving and laughing creating a strange soundtrack to our silent standoff. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't think you'd actually come. I'm here for Emma's wedding," I said evenly, referring to our cousin the bride. "Not to relitigate family drama. I'm hoping we can all be adults about this for one day." Something in my tone, or perhaps just the time that had passed, seemed to deflate her hostility. She sighed, suddenly looking older than her 63 years. "Your father has been telling his version of events for over a year now. I'd like to hear yours if you're willing to share it. Not here, obviously, but maybe after the wedding? Coffee sometime?" The offer surprised me enough that I didn't have a prepared response. All the role-playing with my therapist had focused on defending myself against attacks or deflecting inappropriate questions, not on what to do if someone actually wanted to hear my perspective. I found myself nodding before I'd fully decided. "Sure. Coffee sometime. I'd like that." The ceremony was lovely, our cousin Emma radiant in a way that made me genuinely happy for her. I sat in the back, alone but not lonely, watching two people commit to building a life together, and hoping they'd do better than my father had at honoring their promises. During the reception, I carefully navigated the room, congratulating the bride and groom, chatting politely with relatives who approached me, and strategically avoiding the corner where my father held court with Patricia and Olivia. I saw him, of course. It was impossible not to in a gathering of only about 150 people. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. Patricia stood beside him in a dress that was slightly too formal for a daytime garden wedding, her arm linked through his possessively. Olivia was there too, pointedly ignoring my existence and focusing all her attention on a guy who must have been her new boyfriend. They looked like a complete family unit, closed and self-contained, and I felt nothing looking at them. Not the old ache of exclusion or the sharper pain of betrayal, just a kind of anthropological observation, like watching people I'd studied but never actually known. They'd constructed their version of family, and I'd built mine, and those two structures simply didn't overlap anymore. About halfway through the reception, Uncle Greg appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me one. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay, actually," I said and realized I meant it. It's weird being here, seeing everyone, but it's not as hard as I thought it would be. I think. Enough time has passed that I'm not as raw about everything anymore. "That's growth," Uncle Greg said approvingly. "Also helps that you're not trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. You're just here existing, and they can make of that what they will." We stood together watching the dancing, and I felt grateful for his quiet presence, for the way he'd shown up consistently without requiring anything in return. He'd become the parent figure my father had abdicated, and he'd done it so naturally that I sometimes forgot we weren't actually father and daughter. The evening was winding down, the cake cut and the first dances completed, when my father finally approached me. I saw him coming across the lawn and felt my body tense instinctively, old patterns of anxiety flooding back. Uncle Greg noticed and shifted slightly closer, a silent show of support. "Lorne," my father said when he reached us. His voice was uncertain in a way I'd never heard before, lacking the confident authority that had always characterized his tone. "Can we talk for a minute? Just briefly?" I glanced at Uncle Greg, who gave me a subtle nod that communicated both support for whatever I decided and readiness to intervene if needed. "We can talk here," I said to my father. "Whatever you want to say, you can say it in front of Uncle Greg." My father's jaw tightened briefly, that familiar flash of irritation at not getting exactly what he wanted. But he nodded. "Fine. I just wanted to say that I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. About Christmas and the legal issues and how things fell apart between us. And I wanted you to know that I understand I made mistakes." The words should have meant something. For years, I desperately wanted to hear my father acknowledge that he'd been wrong, that he'd hurt me, that his choices had consequences. But standing there listening to his carefully worded statement, I realized it wasn't actually an apology. It was an acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, passive voice, no ownership, no specifics about what exactly he regretted or understood. "What mistakes?" I asked, my voice calm but insistent. "Specifically, what do you understand you did wrong?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "Well, I should have handled the invitation situation better. Should have talked to you myself instead of having Patricia do it. And maybe I overreacted when you canceled the reservation. Things escalated more than they needed to. The minimization was breathtaking. Should have handled it better." As if the issue was his communication style rather than the fundamental disrespect of uninviting me from a trip I'd fully funded. Overreacted when I canceled. As if my response was the problem rather than his actions that necessitated it. And nothing, absolutely nothing, about the harassment campaign, the threatening messages, the attempts to damage my career, the way he'd tried to weaponize Jake's tuition. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," I said carefully. "But I think we have very different understandings of what actually happened and why it was a problem. Until you're ready to actually examine your behavior and its impact, not just admit that things got messy, I don't think we have much to talk about." My father's expression hardened. The brief moment of vulnerability closing like a door slamming shut. "I'm trying here, Lauren. I'm trying to extend an olive branch, and you're throwing it back in my face. How am I supposed to fix things if you won't even meet me halfway?" "Halfway would require you to actually travel some distance from where you are," I said. "You haven't moved at all. You're still standing in the same place, still believing that a vague acknowledgement of mistakes is sufficient, still expecting me to do all the emotional labor of rebuilding a relationship you destroyed. I'm not interested in halfway anymore, Dad. I'm interested in actual change, actual accountability, actual effort. And until you're willing to provide that, we don't have anything to build on." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant he decided I wasn't worth the effort. His face closed off completely, becoming the cold mask I remembered from every disappointment of my childhood. "Fine," he said shortly. "I tried. Remember that when you're alone wondering why your family doesn't want anything to do with you." He walked away before I could respond, returning to Patricia's side. She immediately leaned in close, clearly asking what had happened. And I saw my father shake his head and say something that made her expression turn smugly satisfied. They'd probably interpret this as me being unreasonable, proof that I was the problem all along. And I found that I genuinely didn't care what narrative they constructed as long as I wasn't required to participate in it. Uncle Greg put his hand on my shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. "You stood your ground without being cruel. You offered him a path forward if he was willing to actually walk it. The fact that he chose not to, that's on him, not you." I nodded, feeling shaky but also strangely liberated. I'd faced my father, had the conversation I'd been dreading, and survived it without crumbling or compromising my boundaries. The worst had happened. He'd tried to make amends on his terms and I'd refused to accept scraps, and I was still standing. Still okay. Still certain I'd made the right choice. The drive home that night was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. I'd confronted my greatest fear. That I'd see my father again and either crumble with longing for reconciliation or explode with unresolved anger, and neither had happened. I'd just been myself, clear about my boundaries, calm in my convictions, and willing to let him make his own choices without controlling how I responded. Jake was waiting up when I got home, ostensibly studying but really just worried about how the wedding had gone. I gave him the full rundown while we ate leftover pizza on the couch, and he listened with that intense focus he'd developed, really hearing not just the words but the emotions underneath. "Are you okay?" he asked when I finished. "Like really okay? Not just putting on a brave face?" "I'm really okay," I said and meant it. It wasn't fun seeing him, and his attempt at an apology was pretty disappointing. But I didn't fall apart. I didn't second-guess myself. I just held my line and let him make his choice, and he chose to walk away. That hurts in a distant kind of way, but it doesn't devastate me like it would have a year ago. I think I've actually healed enough that his rejection doesn't define my worth anymore. Jake smiled, that bright, genuine smile that reminded me so much of our mother. "Good. Because you're worth so much more than he was ever willing to see. And I'm glad you finally know that too." The coffee meeting with Aunt Susan happened in late July, at a small cafe in downtown Portland that was neutral territory for both of us. I arrived early, ordering a latte and claiming a table in the back corner, where we could talk without being overheard. When she arrived, she looked nervous in a way that immediately made me less defensive. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she sat down with her own coffee. "I wasn't sure you would after how I treated you last year." "I'm willing to listen," I said. "I can't promise anything beyond that, but I'm willing to hear what you have to say." She took a breath, then started talking. She told me that she'd only heard my father's version of events initially, a story where I'd promised to pay for Christmas, and then vindicatively canceled out of spite when I wasn't given enough attention. She believed him because he was her brother, and because she admitted with obvious shame. It was easier to believe I was being dramatic than to confront how badly my father had actually behaved. But over the months, she'd heard other things. Uncle Greg had told her his version, which contradicted my father's narrative significantly. She'd overheard Patricia on the phone with a friend, bragging about how they'd managed to get the expensive Lake Tahoe trip funded without having to deal with me being there, laughing about how easy I'd been to manipulate. And she'd watched my father and Patricia over family gatherings, seen patterns she'd been ignoring for years about how they treated Jake, and me versus how they treated Olivia. "I owe you an apology," Aunt Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. "A real one, not the kind your father tried to give you at the wedding. I was wrong to attack you without hearing your side. I was wrong to enable your father's treatment of you by staying silent about it for so many years. And I was wrong to make you feel like you were the problem when you were actually just the first person brave enough to say the emperor has no clothes." Her apology was specific and genuine, acknowledging exactly what she'd done wrong, and why it had been harmful. It was everything my father's non-apology hadn't been. And I felt something tight in my chest finally release. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot to hear." We spent the next 2 hours talking, really talking, about family dynamics I'd thought everyone had been oblivious to. Aunt Susan shared observations about my father that went back to childhood, patterns of behavior where he'd always needed to be right, always required others to accommodate him, always reframed any conflict as other people being unreasonable. She talked about how my mother had softened those edges, how after she died those patterns had intensified without her balancing influence. She also told me something I hadn't known. After my mother's death, when I was 15 and desperately trying to hold our family together while my father retreated into grief, Aunt Susan had tried to intervene. She'd offered to have Jake and me stay with her for a while, to give my father space to process his loss without also having to parent. He'd refused furiously, accusing her of trying to steal his children, and they'd barely spoken for over a year afterward. "I think he was terrified of being seen as a failure," Aunt Susan explained. "Terrified that if anyone helped him, it would mean admitting he couldn't handle things alone. So he white-knuckled his way through grief and parenthood, met Patricia when he was at his lowest, and latched onto her as a solution to all his problems. And then he reshaped his entire life around keeping her happy, because admitting that marriage was a mistake would mean admitting he'd failed at something else." The insight reframed so much of my childhood and adolescence. My father hadn't deliberately chosen Patricia over Jake and me out of cruelty. He'd chosen her out of desperation and fear, and then dug in his heels defending that choice because acknowledging it had been wrong would shatter the narrative he'd built about moving forward and being strong. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped me understand it in a way that made it less personal. As Aunt Susan and I said goodbye that afternoon, promising to stay in touch and maybe have dinner with Uncle Greg sometime soon, I realized that the Lake Tahoe cancellation had done something I'd never anticipated. It had forced everyone in the family to choose sides, yes, but in doing so, it had also revealed who was actually capable of growth and change. Some people, like my father and Patricia and most of their immediate circle, had doubled down on their narratives and their dysfunction. But others, like Aunt Susan and a few cousins who'd reached out cautiously over the months, had used the crisis as an opportunity to examine their own complicity and make different choices. I wasn't getting my whole family back. That fantasy of everyone gathering around a table in harmony was still impossible, and probably always would be. But I was building something more authentic, connections with people who were willing to do the uncomfortable work of honesty and accountability. It was smaller than what I'd had before, but it was infinitely stronger. August brought a different kind of closure. I received notification from Diana that my father was attempting to sue me for the $3,600 he'd lost when I canceled the Lake Tahoe reservation, claiming I'd acted in bad faith and should be responsible for his financial losses. The lawsuit was transparently vindictive and had almost no legal merit, but it still required me to spend time and money responding to it. Diana was confident the case would be dismissed, and she was right. The judge threw it out in preliminary hearings, noting that I'd been the one who'd paid for and booked the reservation, that I'd canceled within my rights according to the contract, and that my father had no standing to sue for losses on a trip he'd uninvited me from. But the attempt itself told me everything I needed to know about where my father's head was at over a year after the initial conflict. He wasn't trying to reconcile. He wasn't working on himself or examining his behavior. He was still focused on punishing me for refusing to accept his treatment, still trying to force me back into compliance through any means available. The frivolous lawsuit was his way of saying I still matter. I can still affect your life. You can't just walk away without consequences. But here's what he didn't understand. The consequences of walking away, dealing with his harassment and his family campaign and his legal threats and his attempts to damage my reputation. All of it was still better than the consequences of staying. The worst he could do to me now was inconvenience me, cost me some legal fees, force me to spend time dealing with his pettiness. He couldn't hurt me the way he'd hurt me before, because I'd stopped giving him access to my vulnerable places. Jake, now fully settled into Portland and thriving in his new university program, took the lawsuit news with eye-rolling disdain. He's officially lost it, he said. Like, congratulations, Dad. You spent however much on a lawyer to accomplish absolutely nothing except proving Lauren was right to cut you off. Real brilliant strategy. His sarcasm made me laugh, breaking the tension I'd been carrying. And really, that was the perfect encapsulation of where we'd ended up. My father's attempts to hurt us had become absurd rather than devastating. His power to affect our lives reduced to mere annoyance rather than existential threat. We'd built something he couldn't touch. A life that functioned without his approval or his presence, and that independence was the ultimate consequence he'd never anticipated. By the time fall arrived, bringing cooler weather and the start of a new academic year for Jake, I found myself in a place I'd never imagined when I'd canceled that Lake Tahoe reservation 18 months earlier. I had a home I loved, a brother who lived with me by choice rather than necessity, a job I excelled at, friends who showed up consistently, therapy that was actually working, and a peace that came from knowing I'd chosen myself even when it was hard. Uncle Greg visited in October, spending a long weekend helping me finish some projects on the house, and taking Jake and me out for a memorable dinner at Portland's best steakhouse. On his last evening, we sat on my back porch with whiskey, and the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who know each other well. Eventually, he broke the quiet with a question I hadn't expected. Do you have any regrets? About how everything went down? About the choices you made? I considered the question seriously, running through the timeline of decisions and consequences. I regretted the pain Jake had experienced being caught in the middle. I regretted the loss of certain family relationships that had been collateral damage. I regretted that my father had proven incapable of the growth that would have allowed reconciliation. But did I regret standing up for myself? Regret canceling the trip? Regret enforcing boundaries even when it blew up my family structure? No, I said finally. I don't regret any of it. I wish it had been easier. I wish my father had been different. But I don't regret choosing myself and protecting Jake. That was the right choice, even though it was hard. Uncle Greg nodded, satisfied. Good. Because you saved your own life, Lauren. Maybe literally. I watched your mom slowly disappear trying to accommodate your dad's needs and demands, trying to be enough for someone who would never be satisfied. You were heading down that same path, and canceling Lake Tahoe was the moment you veered off it. Everything that came after, all the hard stuff, that was the cost of saving yourself. And you were worth saving. His words hit me hard. Tears springing to my eyes unexpectedly. I'd never thought about it in those terms, never considered that staying in those patterns might have been more than just emotionally damaging. But he was right. I'd been disappearing, getting smaller and smaller, sacrificing more and more of myself to maintain relationships with people who viewed me as a resource rather than a person. Another decade of that would have hollowed me out completely. The holidays that year, my second Christmas since the Lake Tahoe disaster, were deliberately simple. Jake and I decided to stay in Portland rather than going to Reno, wanting to establish traditions in our own space. We invited Uncle Greg to come to us instead, along with Nicole and a few other friends who didn't have family nearby. On Christmas Eve, we cooked together from my mother's recipe book, everyone contributing and the kitchen descending into cheerful chaos. We didn't have expensive decorations or catered meals or luxury accommodations. We had mismatched dishes and a slightly lopsided tree that Jake and I had cut ourselves at a local farm, and laughter that came from genuine enjoyment rather than performance. We had Uncle Greg telling stories about my mother that made her real again. We had Nicole teaching everyone her family's traditional Christmas game that involved way too much shouting and not enough rules. We had friends who'd become family, chosen and cherished. As we counted down to midnight on New Year's Eve, squeezed into my living room with champagne and noisemakers, I looked around at the life I'd built from the rubble of the old one, and felt something I'd been missing for years. Gratitude. Not the obligatory kind you're supposed to perform at family gatherings, but the real kind that comes from recognizing genuine blessing. I was grateful for the courage to cancel Lake Tahoe even when I wasn't sure I'd survive the fallout. Grateful for Jake's bravery in choosing to leave with me. Grateful for Uncle Greg's steadfast support, and Aunt Susan's eventual honesty. Grateful for Nicole's friendship and Diana's legal expertise, and my therapist's patient guidance. Grateful for the hard lessons and the painful growth and the clarity that had emerged from the chaos. And strangely, I was even grateful to my father in a twisted way. Not for how he'd treated me, but for finally being so egregious that I couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't make excuses anymore, couldn't keep sacrificing myself anymore. His cruelty had been the catalyst for my liberation. And while I wished it hadn't been necessary, I couldn't regret the outcome. The $8,600 I'd spent and lost had bought me my life back. It had revealed truths I needed to see and forced choices I needed to make. It had cost me a father who'd never really been present anyway, and gained me a family I'd actually chosen. When I calculated the return on that investment, using all my financial training to assess value and worth, the numbers came out overwhelmingly positive. I'd paid $8,600 to discover who I was without the weight of my father's expectations crushing me. I'd paid $8,600 to learn that I was worth protecting and defending. I'd paid $8,600 to build a life based on authenticity, rather than performance. I'd paid $8,600 for freedom. And as the clock struck midnight and everyone cheered and hugged, Jake pulling me into an embrace that felt like home, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth every single penny. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.